Welcome to the Strategy Skills Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Safarova, and our podcast sponsor today is strategytraining.com. If you want to strengthen your strategy skills, you can get the overall approach used in well-managed strategy studies. It's a free download, and you can get it at firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. And you can also get McKinsey and BCG winning resume, also free download. It's a resume that got offers from both of those firms, and you can get it at firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF. And today we have with us Kathleen deLaski, who is an education and workforce designer, as well as a futurist. She founded the Education Design Lab in 2013 to help colleges begin the journey to reimagine higher education towards the future of work, something we all have to do. And she spends time as a senior advisor to the Project of Workforce at Harvard University and teaches human-centered design and higher education reform as an adjunct professor in the Honors College at George Mason University. In a previous career, Kathleen spent 20 years as a TV and then as a digital journalist, including time as ABC News White House correspondent, followed by a political appointment as the first female Pentagon spokesperson. Kathleen, welcome.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be fun.
It is. I'm looking forward to dive into your work, but before we do, I would love to speak about your career as a TV and then digital journalist and all the incredible roles you had. Maybe you could give us a little bit of an overview and we could dig in some of the areas.
Well, just hearing you talk about my time as a journalist, it brings back sad but sort of bittersweet memories because that entire industry has been so disrupted since which is the reason I left it. I was, entered TV journalism in the early 80s and covered, was a local TV reporter and then made it to network news. And at a time when the networks, that was sort of the golden age of television, and you actually knew the names of the people on the evening broadcasts, right? And we tried to report the news in an objective fashion. The 24 news cycle was just being born. So, you had time to report the story. So things changed very, very, very much so. And I actually left ABC News and left the White House correspondent job because the new President Clinton at that time, invited me to become the Pentagon spokesman. And I had been covering those issues, defense issues. And it was such an interesting time. And it just seemed, because the Cold War was just ending, and it seemed so exciting to be at the forefront of defense policy when the Berlin Wall comes down, and you suddenly, what is the role of the U.S. in a world with no longer having two superpowers. We've seen now what that world looks like, but it was fascinating to be in on the beginning of that. And then I went back to digital journalism, where I feel like that really, because it was the dawn of the consumer internet age, where we were just trying to figure out, what do users want on this thing called the internet? It was 1995 was when I started. And my job was to figure out how to do news coverage and political coverage and help people engage in civic engagement. And so, we produced like the first talk show, and we had the first digital talk show and chat rooms. And it was all, very exciting to be able to customize the news for you. But that also kind of taught me, what do users want, and helped me, think about what became my next career in education reform, and looking at education from the perspective of, how is the system not working for users, and how can we change it? So I switched over into education. I was sort of fed up with journalism by about, the year 2000, and have spent the past 25 years really working in first K-12 education reform, mostly urban education, and then moving into higher ed, because to me that's where a lot of the startup work was going. That's where a lot of the innovation was starting to be possible around 2012, 2013, when I started the Education Design Lab.
Such an incredible career. I would love to read your memoir about what it was like to go through
Well,
all the
one
experiences.
one podcaster said that he said, I think you snuck a memoir in this book. So, it definitely has shades of memoir in it, even though it is mostly a book about how to think about how to redesign higher education.
Kathleen, and if you go back to yourself in those early 80s and you're just starting out and you could just sit down with yourself and give yourself advice, what would you tell yourself?
Wow, that's a really good question. I think it would probably be slow down. I was always in such a hurry to get somewhere. And, then when you get there, like, I was a very young television newscaster, at ABC News. I was 28 years old and I was sort of like, okay, I've arrived. I was always trying to prove something. And then you're, and then you're, then you always feel like you're trying to, prove yourself when you're much younger than everybody around you. I was the Pentagon spokesman at 33 and I had generals reporting to me. And it was, I always had imposter syndrome, right? And so I wish I'd slowed down and, maybe not tried to get those fabulous jobs that were opening up to women at that time at such early ages. And that I had just kind of, savored the moments and not been in such a hurry. I don't know why I was in a hurry. I think it was just my type A personality.
And maybe if you were not in a hurry, you would not have opportunities to have those roles.
That could be true. And you do when people say, wow, your career's been all over the map. And I say, yeah. And maybe all those pieces I can figure out in each piece that I've done, like it sort of adds up to what I'm doing now, which is trying to be an advocate, that can cross, business, education, government. I'm also a philanthropist. And, the truth is that, to kind of speak truth to power in these settings, it helps build credibility and empathy if you've actually lived in each of these worlds. So the fact that I have this like all over the map resume, I feel like is finally paying off.
Oh, I think it definitely pays off. You've done so much during that period of time. You had many careers. You just packed it all together. So you mentioned savoring the moment. So what kind of moments would you want to really enjoy and slow down time to really take in during those years?
Oh, that's really interesting. Well, one of the things, and if I ever write another book, which I don't know if I will, was certainly, on the home front. I was in the first generation of women who were convinced that we could do it all, right? And so I tried to do it all. I had a nanny, I had a full-time nanny, I had the children, in my early 30s. And looking back, I wish I'd savored those moments, maybe taken a few years off. I mean, it was unthinkable to do that as a TV reporter because you would never be able to get back into it. And, I did make the sacrifice to say, okay, I'll be a Washington correspondent because I won't have to travel as much. But, looking back on it now, and I talk to my now grown daughters about this, and, we all agree, it would have been great. I should have taken a couple of years off and been a stay-at-home mom. But at that time, that there was so much pressure not to step off the escalator and sit back. So I'd say the home front moments are the ones I most wish that I could have savored. And then I would say, probably my two most exciting jobs for me were being the Pentagon spokesman at, such an interesting moment, and then being, on the front lines of AOL, America Online, as it was called then, as we went to, 500,000 members, 1 million members, 10 million members. I was there during all those years. And it was such an exciting moment as we were trying to figure out this new thing called the internet. And I wish that I had kept a journal, because I would love to write a book about that. But it was moving so fast, like I can't remember everything that went on there, So I think those probably two work experiences were the ones I wish I'd, reflected upon more.
Makes a lot of sense. So going back to that moment of you sitting with yourself, any other advice would you give yourself work-wise, how to be successful, how to progress in a way in your career that is optimal for you?
Yeah. I mean, and I will say it does feel like the workplace, like what worked then is not necessarily what works now. Because running a nonprofit organization over the last, 12 years, I also, felt firsthand how different it feels to be a lead, an organizational leader, now versus, even 10 or 20 years ago. So some of the advice doesn't really translate through the years, because my first reaction to your question would be to say, have more confidence. Um, I did not have a lot of confidence in any role that I had, partly because I was always, as I mentioned earlier, doing it probably before I should have been doing it. So I felt young and inexperienced. I was a woman, often in a room with mostly men, and so I was always hyperventilating on the way home from work. So confident, I think, like, and then watching other people that just seem so like they're not thinking too hard about it, right? They're just being authentic, and they're being leaders. I mean, I was always almost like hyper empathetic about, oh, what will they think of that? How will they react to that? In real time, which I think hampered um, my success. Definitely, I was too in my head about what I was doing, and it often came through. I remember one boss said to me, you're you're too he said my style was, I was not fluid enough. And I said, that's because I'm thinking, I'm projecting out what I'm going to say, what I'm going to do. And he said, well, it comes across as you're being halting, and that's not good. He was trying to be helpful.
It's a very powerful advice. I often tell clients that very same advice, and it makes such a big difference not being in your head, really
Mm-hmm.
being authentic, as you mentioned, but placing your attention on the other person, or in your situation, you're speaking to many people. Although I know that placing attention on one person, even when you're speaking to many people, is even more effective, because on the
Mm.
other side, there's always only one person listening or watching you.
I love that.
What was it like to be White House correspondent?
I would say the hard part, I mean, it was really fun to be one of the, they used to call it the boys on the bus, because there was a book written about journalists, who would be on a beat, and, it was mostly men back in the day. And so to be one of the girls, or just people on the bus, where you're following a candidate, because I covered the very, partly the very end of Reagan on a part-time basis, and then I covered Bush one, so Bush the dad, we call him. I covered him full time, from like 19, like for like a year and a half, 1991, and then through the election when he ran against Clinton. And so we're always getting on an airplane and going off together as the press corps, and then covering the president, and you're going with him on vacation over Christmas, or Thanksgiving. You're following him to the NATO summit. Wherever he goes, you go and you either go on the plane behind, or some of you get to travel, on a rotating basis in Air Force One, which is really fun. And the president will come back and chat with you. And so and that's what's so different about today, apparently, now, when, there's such antagonism between the press corps and the president. In those days, sure, you were kept at arm's length, but it was not a hostile environment. And so, it was a lot of fun, to be, banding back and forth with the newsroom humor, a lot of, cynicism and trading of ideas, going out for drinks, so that was a lot of fun. The hard part was doing TV. As my Brit Hume, who later went on to Fox, was my comrade, and we sat in a little room in the just off the West Wing of the White House, and he would answer the phone, and he would say, "ABC News, scratching the surface all over the world," and my point there is that we never had enough information, because we were covering everything that went through the White House. So I remember one time being out on the lawn, the White House lawn, at 5 a.m. with my mic, having to cover trade talks, and it's not an expertise of mine, and yet you're getting these questions thrown at you and you're like totally faking it until you make it. Can I sound credible describing what's happening in Japan right now? No, the answer, I always felt like the answer should be no. And so that was always the hard part, was to sound, responsible and to be actually adding value as opposed to just talking, and I found that hard.
You had proximity to president for a long period of time. What do you think people don't understand about what it is like to be president of the United States that you could see?
Well, Trump is trying to change this paradigm, but I think one of the hard parts about being president, and George Bush, the dad, used to complain to us about this, was you're always hostage to the news cycle, and whatever the world is talking about, that's what you have to talk about, and it's hard to change the agenda and get them to cover your story, or what you want. Like I remember, a few years later when I was covering Bush 2 as a candidate, and he came to AOL to do the first ever presidential live chat. It was going to be a digital live chat, which was going to be aired, and we had a lot of press coverage because it was the first time a presidential candidate had ever done an online chat, right? And I was the one interviewing him. And I remember he came back to the green room, and the backstage. He comes in and he meets me and he's like, "Okay, we're going to talk about tort reform." And I said, "No, we're not." I said, this is a live chat. We're going to talk about whatever, the American public, that, or whatever small portion at this point, this was 2000, whatever the, public wants to talk about. And you could just see he got nervous, and ended up at the front page of the New York Times the next morning was he flubbed an answer about who was the prime minister versus the president of India. Somebody was trying to, gotcha him on his knowledge of foreign affairs, and so that was the news, so, I think that's the hardest thing, and it's not really fair. And I think, what we're watching Donald Trump do right now is, an example of how he's learned since the last time he was president, how to own the news cycle. He is doing that very well.
And then you became a spokesperson for Pentagon. Do you remember the moment when it happened? What did you feel?
Well, yeah, I remember. It's funny. It happened when I was on a White House trip with President Clinton to, we were at a naval base in Coronado Bay, San Diego. And I was just there last week and I hadn't been there since the day I was standing in the parking lot and somebody said, like White House on line 3 for you, I was like, what? And that wasn't him calling, of course, me, it was somebody on the, the team. That was, so I still remember like where I was standing when I got the call. Yeah, and then my first day on the job, which was, I think, July of 93, we announced the policy, don't ask, don't tell, the gays in the military policy. And, so I wasn't involved in shaping it, but I had to be very involved in announcing it. And that was a crazy first day.
What do you think was the reason they picked you from all the other people they could have picked?
Well, I think, I was actually brought on 6 months into his administration, and there had been someone else in the job that was picked first because he'd been, just sort of the sidekick of Les Aspin, the congressman who was picked to be Secretary of Defense, and he was failing. He was failing in the role, so it was described to me, because the press, he was kind of at war with the press, and so they wanted to replace him with somebody who was from the press corps and had a good relationship with the press, knew defense issues. And so they knew me. Some of the people on the defense team, I had been they had been mentors of mine when I was at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, where I focused on defense policy.
And once you started in that role, can you take us through that period a little bit? What was it like?
Gosh, it was a long time ago. It was hard for me because I had to win the respect of both the military side and the political side, because the Clinton White House and the Clinton national security apparatus, it wasn't, Clinton was not getting a lot of accolades for his, treatment with the military and the way he was, paying attention or not paying attention to the military. And so I actually found that because I was, in the building with the generals, and Colin Powell was the joint chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, and he was, a very interesting leader to learn from. I felt like the military supported me, and the generals I had to work with every day supported me more than the politicals across the river, at the White House. So that was a weird dynamic that I did not expect. But I'd say we had ups and downs. I mean, it went, some aspects went very well, but we were thrown a lot of tough crises. The biggest of which was the Somalia crisis, where I think it was 18 died. It was if you ever saw the movie Black Hawk Down, I was the one who had to announce that, I think it was 18 U.S. soldiers, were being dragged through the streets of Mogadishu. And that was, I think, the first time that we'd seen loss of life, in a guerrilla combat situation, since Vietnam. So, that was horrible. And my boss ended up getting fired over it. And I ended up leaving about 6 months after that. Or I didn't leave the Pentagon, but I left that role because the new defense secretary wanted to bring his own person in.
Why do you think your boss got fired over it?
Well, in these military situations, and particularly when, the commander in chief feels that he's, weak on defense, he's got to take a strong stand. And, it's like heads will roll, somebody has to take the fall. And in the military, that's a kind of a thing, the captain goes down with his ship, right? And, that's what happened. Somebody had to take the fall. And I went with Les Aspin to the White House the day I stood outside the Oval Office while, Bill Clinton thanked him for his service. And, I think I later got fired because I was, sort of put in a different strategy job, but, same thing really, because I was seen as, not keeping my, as they say, not keeping my principal in his lane, to say the right things at the right time. He was somebody who really liked to talk to the press, and, I was seen as not controlling him, my boss, which is, as we all know, it's very hard to control your boss. But, that's what I was told about, why and so I took on a very interesting job instead, which was kind of more of a communications policy role of, trying to help, like, how do we change the hearts and minds as we want to expand NATO and as we wanted to, think about nuclear drawdowns. A lot of the stuff that's now coming to roost, years later with Ukraine and with loose nukes. I was very involved in sort of, awareness campaigns and national and international, messaging campaigns around that work. So it was a lot. It was quite interesting work.
And while you had this very challenging role, you had a family that you were raising as well.
Mm-hmm.
How did you do that?
Well, in fact, I was pregnant with my second. Well, here's when my boss got fired, I assumed I would be fired right away, and I'd wanted to have a second child, and so we thought, oh, let's start trying to have our number two, and I got pregnant right away, and then I wasn't fired. And so then I was trying to travel the world while I was pregnant. And I mean, I think that's one of the reasons that I got asked to do this other role. We were doing trips to Kazakhstan and, Kiev and under kind of rough conditions. And so, yeah, it was not easy. And we had a full-time nanny, which we felt was, the way to go, for continuity for our child, because it was hard to be at daycare to pick them up at a certain time, right?
Of
So
course,
I had two daughters.
that's incredible. Yeah, very productive person and very efficient and effective with your time. What you're doing now, of course, very demanding, but throughout your career, you had such demanding roles that people usually, to be successful, they often have to cut out everything else in their life and just be that.
You're right. It is hard. I mean, I think, and I wonder, about the next generation. And I talk to my daughters about this, and this is where I think I could maybe write another book called, "Can I Have It All?" or "Can We Not Have It All?" or something. Because I mean, I was very influenced when I was a kid by that. You're too young to know this TV show. It was called The Mary Tyler Moore Show, and she was in the show. She worked in a TV news setting. And, she started out as a secretary, I think, and then she became a producer. And that was my first glimpse into this interesting TV world that looked like it was something women could do besides, being a teacher or a nurse, which were great roles, but I knew that I would not be good at them. And so I was really paying attention to this TV show, and I was like 12, and the song in the TV show, she throws up her hat and she says, "You're going to make it after all. You can have it all." That was sort of the mantra in the 70s, right?
It's incredible how much we are influenced as children and very young adults by TV and books. And then it just sets our entire direction where we are going, and how careful we have to be now as adults in terms of shaping what is available for younger people and what they are influenced and inspired by.
So true.
So to wrap up this incredible discussion, before we transition to what you're doing now, I also want to touch on something. So you mentioned that after that, you continued in journalism for a while. And you mentioned that at that period of time, you really learned what users want. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about what did you discover that they actually wanted?
Yeah, well, it was before the terms UX or UI were invented, or at least I think so. And they weren't used in the context of online, which of course they are now. And we started doing, we had a vice president of user experience, which to me was like a mind-blowing idea in the early 90s. And there was a lot of focus on, well, actually it was called member experience because we were called members, AOL members. As we were starting to create these experiences for, people who wanted to get their news, and you started to think for the first time about, well, they could talk about the issues they want to learn about, and we could send them an email. That was like mind-blowing, this idea that you could do it that way. And we could do live chats, and we could have a live chat just for Republicans and a live chat just for Democrats. And then we're like, oh no, but that's going to create a bubble and they won't talk to each other. That's going to be a problem. And of course, we ended up doing that because that's what users clearly wanted. They wanted to find their own people. And we ended up, creating chat rooms by topic and by party. And then when the analytics became available, where for the first time you could look at what users were clicking on a page. And, we first started, using the term clickbait, okay, what's going to be clickbait? And then those of us who came from, true journalism, we were like, we can't do clickbait. That would be, immoral. And then the people who came from, marketing were like, what do you mean? Of course we should do clickbait, And so there was that, we call it the battle for the homepage, because AOL's homepage, by 99 or 2000, you're having, I don't know, tens of millions of people coming through that page. And so if you could buy the click on the homepage, and that was huge. And in fact, I feel that's the reason we lost out to Google. I mean, this little startup named Google, these guys show up, and they were like, we were like, who are these guys? They were like, um, and their page was so ugly, it was so plain. And but those of us that were more purists and didn't want to sell search, we're like, they've got it. I mean, this is the answer. You can't sell search, right? You're going to lose the trust of your users. And sure enough, AOL, I believe that was one of AOL's downfalls. But we were, the purists, or the more journalistic people didn't win the day there. And so that's an example of where I think it was fascinating being at the beginning of the period when you could start to learn, what users were clicking on and how you could monetize that, or when you should monetize that. I was responsible for creating the news policy at AOL, where we, decided, okay, we're going to box things in and put sponsored content on that. And people were like, no, why do we have to do that? And, we pushed for that, like, because, someone's paying to be there. It's not necessarily the best search. And that was all fascinating, being at the beginning of that and seeing how users responded to one type of treatment on a web page versus another.
So in your experience, people actually did not realize that what you were doing was for them, so that they get the best results, and they were kind of okay with clicking on sponsored links that were maybe not even often clearly marked by another provider.
Yeah, I think in the early days, it was really hard. We, like, if somebody, we had these different channels, like, I was running the news channel, and I was also running the parenting channel for a while. And, in the parenting channel, it felt okay to have, like, Gerber Foods sponsor the diaper talk, or something, or but it didn't feel okay to have, IBM, mixing its content in with the business news, right? And that's the distinction that had not been, people hadn't learned to do that correctly or to do that ethically at the time.
So how do you transition from that to your work now?
From AOL, I went to, I got a job. I wanted to kind of get out of journalism. And I got a role as head of brand marketing and communications at Sallie Mae, which it happened to be, located near my house. I had two small children at this point. I wanted to, or two, actually not so small, but young children. I wanted to, kind of rein in the chaos in my life and do something meaningful. And the reason I took the job was one piece of it was to start Sallie Mae's foundation. They had just been given $50 million through an acquisition that had to be spent on, philanthropic causes. And so my family had a family foundation at this point. So, I understood philanthropy a little bit. And I was very excited to think about, gosh, how do I help, the nation's largest student lender, like, make college more accessible by using this money for, to pick up where the business model leaves off. And that seemed kind of exciting. I was from, my family is mostly entrepreneurs. And so, the idea of getting into business was sort of interesting to me at that point.
And you recently wrote a book, Who Needs College Anymore?
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the key things you wanted people to get from that book?
Well, so I spent, in that journey, once I got into education, I spent time in K-12. I left Sallie Mae after 8 years and was involved in helping charter schools start up mostly in urban areas. And then I was also on the board of a public university here in Virginia for 8 years. And then while I was on that board, I got the idea, because it was when there was a lot of disruption beginning to happen, or at least talk of disruption happening in education around with the this is in like 2012, 2013, you had the kind of rise of the MOOCs. Do you remember MOOCs? MOOCs are massive open online courses that groups like Stanford and MIT and Harvard were starting to let people like take courses for free that otherwise you'd have to, pay, tens of thousands of dollars, and you could only have access to it if you went to an exclusive school. And so there was talk of like unbundling higher education. At the same time, colleges were starting to, struggle, like enrollment was starting to fall off a little bit. And they were very worried about, well, gosh, if they unbundle education, if private capital comes in, venture capital comes in and unbundles education, what's going to happen to colleges? So I was very interested in starting a nonprofit. I along the way had started some other ones to help colleges really look at how to kind of design their own future, how to help design shorter pathways than college to help learners get to specific jobs that were in high demand. So kind of like the boot camp movement that was starting up then, how could colleges sort of boot camp themselves, where needed and where desired by users, by consumers. And this, proved harder. At that point, it was really just a set of ideas. And I think if you fast forward to now, it's really happening all over the country, even you could say all over the world. So the organization that I founded, I've now stepped down as CEO after 10 years, is full in on that work, doing what we call micro pathways, helping colleges create micro pathways so that people can have like a 6 to 12 month academic journey instead of or on the way to a 2-year or a 4-year degree.
For whom do you think college is still relevant and for whom it's not relevant anymore?
Yeah, I have a whole chapter on this because, the book is called Who Needs College Anymore? And so I actually do try to answer the question because I in my work and just in my own, home life, I get that question a lot. Okay, does my kid need to go to college? And what it really comes down to, so I use a human-centered design methodology in the book because that's the organization, the lab is, bases its strategy on a human-centered design methodology. And I create like typologies or, personas for who needs college and who doesn't, or at least who could forego it. Because, as I say at the outset, if you've got the bankroll, if mom and dad are paying, and you've got the time, you're not encumbered as a single mom, or or you're have a like neurodivergent issues where you need a different solution. Absolutely, go for it. You can always leave, right? Which 40% of people do. Don't finish college for whatever reason. So that's my starting point. Give it a try if money's not the issue. But that scenario is, or the scenario of not being able to afford at least the 4-year degree that could get you the really transformative experience is available to fewer and fewer folks as college becomes more expensive. And as frankly, people become less willing to, sit at the desk for 4 years. They feel like so much is available, in the palm of their hand from learning on YouTube or taking short form courses on Coursera or, any of these. There's a lot of offerings out there that can help you get to a certification or a certificate. And colleges themselves have started offering those. So what I say to folks is if you're over age, like if you're, in your mid to late 20s or older, and you have access to some funds, and you're connected in some way, you've got some social capital, I would say college wouldn't be your first stop. It might be your second or third if you can't make it work, or if you decide that you want a career that that only college can get you. Like, you decide you want to be a doctor or a clinical therapist or a lawyer. It's going to be decades before those careers don't require college. What I think for those people, the good news, if you think 4 years or a couple $100,000 is too high a hurdle, is that the graduate schools and undergrads, a few undergrads are starting to come down in length, right? So I think the gauntlet will get shorter. But if you are looking at a career in, for example, many parts of tech, many parts of healthcare besides, doctor, nurse, therapist, advanced manufacturing, many parts of business, some parts of education. I mean, education's changing a bit. We can talk about that. You have options. It's not to say you wouldn't benefit from college. You probably would, but you have options if it's not available to you, if college isn't available to you. And then the people who definitely need college, which kind of, this research kind of even surprised me, because I was looking at the numbers, and college is sort of holding steady, or college enrollment is holding steady best for actually lower income people and people of color. And you might say, oh, that seems counterintuitive, but I think the reason is that those are the folks for whom the promise of college is college can be the ticket. Like, if you are an immigrant family and you're trying to transport your family, to the middle class, you need that structured support system. You need someone else to help your children figure out the code switching and the contacts and the social capital. Those are necessary ingredients to get where you want to go. And so that's probably the largest group of people that I would say, absolutely, let's help you find a college that is lower cost but has great social mobility records. And there's a guy named Raj Shetty who's done research that I talk about in the book on which colleges, what type of colleges. A lot of the state colleges are particularly good at that. And then the other category, or another category, because I won't go into all of them, but another one that's kind of interesting is this idea of legitimacy label. Like, if you feel just yourself that you're not taken seriously unless you have that piece of paper, then you should try to get it, And I mean, I know I felt this way in the 70s in the career I just described to you. I don't know that I would feel that way now. I don't know. I mean, if I were a young person, I mean, confidence has never been my strong suit, so maybe I would. I feel like one of my daughters definitely felt that way. The other, so I have one daughter who went to college and one who did not. I interview in the book a woman from a family that where the parents were just really pushing her to go, and she went all the way to get a PhD. But it's not surprising that women of color hold the most college debt. I mean, as a group, and they have the most graduate school debt too. And that's that actually doesn't surprise me, based on these personas that I'm talking about, and the legitimacy that that I think women in particular, and women of color even more so, feel that they need in the marketplace to sell themselves.
Such an important topic. Thank you so much for covering it. I know we only have a few minutes left, and I would love to have another discussion on this if you would like to go deeper into your work, because what you're doing is very important. I wanted to wrap up today by asking you, probably we only have time for one last question before we wrap up. So I wanted to ask you my favorite question of all time. Over the last few years, what were maybe 2-3 aha moments, realizations that really changed the way you look at life or the way you look at business?
Over the past few years, let's see. Well, I would say, kind of, I am kind of I like to think at a systems level. And I would say that, one of them, came during the pandemic, when, as an employer, running an organization that suddenly, had to go virtual, and yet we were at a point in our trajectory where, the pandemic sort of actually gave more impetus to our work, because our work was about how do we help people get to work faster. I mean, I was so fascinated by the great shakeup, where in 2021, first in 2020, there were huge layoffs, and then people tried to find adjacent roles, and you could see just the movement of people trying to scramble into other jobs that weren't, frontline facing. And then in 2021, like 50 million people quit their jobs. And then again in 2022, another 50 million people quit their jobs. And I'm an employer in the middle of this thinking, oh blank, how do we keep people here? And we had people quit. And it's like everyone at the same time, like, analyzed their situation and tried to decide, am I happy with my kind of work? Am I happy with my, my profile, in terms of how much time my work-life balance. And I just was so shocked that many people would have the aha moment at the same time. And, that's totally slowed down now. We don't see that kind of turnover, anywhere. And maybe partly because the economy is not doing as well. So people are afraid to leave their current jobs. But I found that staggering, and, tried to draw. I mean, the lesson I drew from that was, okay, we're kind of experiencing a culture shift here where, my generation, as we talked about earlier, that I can do it all, is giving way to the next generations, and they are rebalancing the norm and the narratives. And I think they're still in place. And that, I found that fascinating.
Incredible. Kathleen, you're such an incredibly sophisticated, interesting person that I could talk to forever.
Well, that will help my confidence. Thank you.
I really enjoyed speaking with you. Thank you so much for being here and for being so open with us during this conversation. Where can our listeners learn more about you, buy your book, anything you want to share?
Yes, thank you. Well, I have created a website for the book, which also can get you to information about me and my LinkedIn and whatnot. But it's the book's name, Who Needs College Anymore.org. And it also has discussion guides. If we didn't get to talk about how employers, there's a big role for employers to play in how the future of work can get weaved into the future of education. I have a chapter on that in the book, but that's certainly, I've got discussion guides in the on the website that you can download.
Kathleen, thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you.
Our guest today again has been Kathleen deLaski. Check out her book. It's called Who Needs College Anymore? And our podcast sponsor today is strategytraining.com. If you want to strengthen your strategy skills, you can get the overall approach used in well-managed strategy studies. It's a free download, and you can get it at firmsconsulting.com/overall approach. You can also get McKinsey and BCG winning resume, which is a resume that got offers from both of those firms. And you can get it at firmsconsulting.com/resume PDF. And the last gift I will leave you with is a copy of a book that I co-authored with some of our amazing clients. You can get it as a gift at firmsconsulting.com/gift. And it is called 9 Leaders in Action. Thank you everyone for tuning in. And I'm looking forward to connect with you all next time.